Welcome back. Welcome back. Can we get started? Is it okay with you? Thank you for your return. It's always the fear that a facilitator has. You let them go leave the room, and will they come back? So I'm always think it's like a little joy that they be returned. So thank you. If you recall this morning when I started this session, I said we were going to cover today, sort of taking that which we heard yesterday, and we're just kind of refining it. We're bringing it down closer and closer to the earth, and closer to the work that you're doing on a daily basis. So far this morning, we've really talked about what I would describe in many respects were some real tactics, some things that you could start to do that would capture people's imagination, capture people's confidence, capture people's trust. Now we're going to move yet a little further along in the spectrum, and we're going to look at taking those ideas that you have about the neighborhood and what it can be, and framing one of the key projects in it that embodies, and this is the key piece, that embodies all of the things that we're saying about it being a place of choice. So how do we develop housing that is something which people will choose to live in, not feel trapped, not feel that they don't have access, but will choose to live in? So I'm going to turn it over to Lucy Blackburn, and she, as the I'm going to call her the team captain here on the housing side, and let her really kind of lead us through what this process looks like.
Thank you, Reese. Good morning, everybody. I want to take just a second before we start the presentation to let you know who's joining me here today. To my left is Roma Campanile, and she is architect extraordinaire for Choice Neighborhoods, Hope 6 Mixed Finance. So she's one of our key team members. Next to her is April Kennedy and Glenda Graves. They're both joining us from New Orleans today. April was the project manager for the Iberville Choice Neighborhoods Implementation Grant. That was one of the first grants that we awarded back in 2010, and she is basically single-handedly managed and run this whole program for 7 years by herself. And then
looks marvelous for someone who hasn't slept in 2 years. Right?
And then Glenda Graves, you already heard about her yesterday from the secretary talking about her great success moving from the Iberville public housing development now to her own home and serving as a leasing agent with HRI Properties, which was the developer for Iberville. So they're going to tell you a little bit more about themselves when they do their presentation. But right now, I'm going to start by kind of doing a very high-level discussion of your housing component. So, as you know, this session does focus on the housing component of your grant. And I think yesterday Mindy said Choice Neighborhoods is really primarily a housing program, but housing doesn't need to be just bricks and mortar. Housing can be a major catalyst for redevelopment in your neighborhood, and housing can support your efforts to increase self-sufficiency of residents. So it's really just more than housing, and Choice Neighborhoods embraces this broad concept of housing. So just to remind you that Choice Neighborhoods does have 3 goals, and those you should have them memorized by now. If you don't, you should say them with me. Housing, people, and neighborhood. You know, those are the 3 components of our grants and the things that you want to focus on. To achieve these 3 goals, your task over the next couple of years is to develop and implement a transformation plan that addresses these 3 goals. And in this session, we're going to hone in on housing, but as I already said, housing really isn't viewed by itself. It's sort of a component of your broader neighborhood, and they're all tied together. So just a quick look at our session. I'm going to go over some broad goals and expectations for choice related to housing. Then we're going to switch over to our main presentation, which is going to be how the Iberville grant formed its housing plan. So there you're really going to get into the real world, and that's going to be, I think, really interesting to you to see what they really did. Okay, so what is the big goal for housing in choice neighborhoods? Make distressed housing great again. I mean, how timely could that concept be? Make distressed housing great again. So that's what we're striving for. But seriously, looking a little bit more at the housing goals, the basic housing goal and objective of choice neighborhood is to replace the targeted distressed housing with housing that is financially viable, meaning you can actually build it and run it, well managed, energy efficient, healthy, accessible to all, and mixed income. Mixed income is a really important concept to choice neighborhoods, and for that reason, I wanted to just take a moment to look a little more closely at mixed income, because I think that's not always something that people associate with redevelopment of distressed public or assisted housing. So here's our definition of mixed income housing. Basically, it's just housing that includes units that are available to families of a broad range of incomes. For example, it might include public housing units, units restricted by tax credit funding, units restricted by Section 8 funding, and units with no income restrictions at all. All these units would be part of your development, and they would all be included in the same buildings. So why is mixed income housing so important to us at choice neighborhoods? Well, it provides units for all people. Everyone can live in your development. It allows for diversity in your buildings and in your development. And we believe diversity makes a stronger neighborhood. It deconcentrates poverty. Not all your units are low income, and your project is not labeled as low income housing. Provides room to grow. Families that might start in the lower income units of your housing, as they prosper, they can move up to units that has a less income restriction on it, or move up to a unit that has no income restriction on it. And actually, when we say move from unit to unit, your families really wouldn't even need to move, because most projects include what we refer to as floating units. So your units are not specifically income designated. It's just the overall mix in your buildings or in your development that has a variety of income restrictions on it. Families who live there and have broad ranges of income are going to support your local businesses. They're going to promote economic development, and you might even end up getting the grocery store that we know that everybody would really like to have in their neighborhood. Also, as Glenda pointed out to me, it also supports your residents, because oftentimes residents will be relocated, they prosper while they relocate, their incomes go up, and if you didn't have non-income restricted units, they wouldn't be able to come back. Yeah, so it's important to your residents to know they can come back to their homes even if their incomes have risen. I do want to be clear on one thing, though, that mixed income housing does not mean that the low income units that are being demolished are not all going to be replaced. Choice Neighborhoods has a 1-to-1 replacement requirement for all target housing units which are demolished during the grant period. So actually the number of units you're building back is larger than the number that have been demolished. Just a quick look to delve a little bit deeper into why you might want to consider having unrestricted units. Unrestricted units are basically just those that have no restrictions, anybody who can live there. It's, as Reese said, it's housing for people who have a choice. They can choose to live there, they can choose to live somewhere else. For this reason, it means your project needs to be competitive. with all those other projects. You need to have good design and amenities that attract people. And this is actually good for everybody who lives in your buildings, whether they're low income or high income. Everybody deserves good design and amenities. And once the project is built, your property has to be maintained so that those people who have choice will actually stay there. And this means that your property is better managed, well maintained, and that again is good for everybody who lives in your building. Having units with no income restriction allows for growth in the future as your neighborhood expands. And actually, some residents who will live in your development who may not have income restrictions eventually may decide to buy a home, move out and buy a home in your neighborhood. So that's good for your neighborhood. So there are really kind of a lot of practical reasons why having unrestricted units in your development make good sense. Just to touch on what you want to do to be sure that your mixed income development is successful. Broaden your minds, think beyond low income housing, plan in advance. Make sure everybody knows that mixed income housing can benefit everyone. Carefully consider your mix of units, what's right for your property, and focus on property management to be sure that everybody who lives in your housing is going to be successful. And engage residents early so they understand that this is not a tactic to prevent them from coming back to the housing. Speaking of engaging residents early, we wanted to touch base a little bit on resident engagement, but actually, having listened to the conversations yesterday, I think you all probably already get it. You know how important it is. In Choice Neighborhoods, we expect you to have a strategy for engaging your residents. We want them to be engaged early in the process. And I'm talking about original residents of the public housing or assisted housing, but also residents in your neighborhood. We want the engagement to be meaningful, provide capacity building for residents to help them engage in a meaningful way. You know, try a variety of tactics. I think you already touched on a lot of them. Even your action activities involving residents and getting their input, because they're people who live in the neighborhood and they probably know it a lot better than you do. So they're an excellent source of information about your neighborhood. Again, why do resident engagement? Well, don't do it just because Choice Neighborhoods tells you you have to do it. I mean, do it because it makes sense. It's critical to the success of your project. I mean, people who don't understand what's going on don't support it. People who don't trust you aren't going to believe what you say. Delays happen when people don't understand what's going on. So don't miss the opportunity to quote one of our former presidents, to do it early and to do it often. So now I'm just going to switch gears a little bit to give you a very high-level discussion of what to think about when you're doing your housing plan. What broad concepts should you consider? First of all, simple but critical, who's going to live in your project? Your project must accommodate those that are going to be living there, and you must accommodate residents who are returning to your project. So keep those residents in mind. What are their characteristics? Are they a lot of families, a lot of kids, elderlies, single folks? Keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, who do you want to attract in the future? What does your future look like? Right now, you might know who's going to live there, but you want to be able to accommodate the future. You want to do a good market study, which is one of the Choice Neighborhoods requirements. So until you understand who's going to live in your housing, you can't really move forward with designing it. Next, you want to be very conscious of the neighborhood context. One thing quickly just to say on this, you want to carefully consider if your target housing site is where you want to redevelop. We have some sites, I think public housing is notoriously put in bad locations on bad property. So if you're in a floodplain or your site's contaminated or it's on a railroad track or whatever, you might want to consider alternate sites. That's happened in some of our grants. So you want to complement the neighborhood. Old public housing used to be isolated and of a different design and density. That was maybe popular 50 years ago, but not today. Now they look like sore thumbs. So just be sure that you're complementing the history, the density, the land use, the architecture of your neighborhood. Composition, what's your housing development going to look like? Whole laundry list of stuff. What type of building, townhouses, mid-rises, duplexes, how many units are you going to have? How many bedrooms with a square footage? Certainly a long list of items you need to think about. A couple of them that you maybe haven't thought about, livability. You want to say, Roma, a word about livability and furnishability?
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, having enough room to navigate through an apartment, especially when you get to accessibility requirements.
Closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. My voice usually carries very well. That's very important. Also, picking up on local architectural character is important to establishing your community and its place in the neighborhood. Having your streets connect, getting rid of super block configuration so that you connect to the adjacent neighborhoods, not only through streets, but also through sidewalks and trails and open space, putting houses close to the sidewalk so that people can watch who's coming and going, which are sort of basic defensible space principles. Is that good?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
That's good. And also considering what sort of amenities you need to provide. Again, people who have choice are looking for amenities along things like basic amenities, washers, dryers, community rooms, pools, car washing areas, dog washing areas, all these amenities. Consider what's appropriate for your development in terms of who's going to live there, who do you want to attract to live there. Again, also one other thing, indistinguishable or floating units. All your units should be the same. Somebody who's living in an unrestricted unit, their unit should not be any different than somebody who's living in a public housing unit. Those units should be comparable. And again, because they're floating, they can't be different because people will just live in whatever unit is available at the time they move in. Overall comment on design. Just because this is going to have low-income housing units in it doesn't mean that you can ignore the design of your building. It should be something you're proud of, something that enhances the neighborhood. Make it something that, again, doesn't look like low-income housing, our idea of low-income housing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to plan for open space, plan for small play areas, also connections to local trails, sidewalks, and adjacent neighborhoods. Really important.
So last but not least, financing. Obviously, if you don't have any money, you can't build your building. So financing is critical. We're not going to go over all the many sources of financing that are out there, but all we say is be creative. I did have a slide on here, though I took it out, showing one of my projects that had probably 10 different sorts of financing. And in fact, the Iberville projects had local tax credit, state tax credit, federal historic tax credits.
Home, CDBG.
CDBG, home, about anything you could think of. So be creative in looking at your financing, and we at HUD will be glad to help you and share with you some potential sources. So with that,
Lucy, may I just ask, this slide deck will be available to people following the conference convening on HUD's
Yes.
choice site. So in looking through some of these, I think you may find there's some nice material that you might want to use in making your local presentations and trying to help your own partners to just understand the program better. So this full set will be available as well. And in selecting your developer. Good point. So that you can really sort of say, this is the standard I am planning to work towards. That's great. Thank you. I'm sorry.
okay. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over, clicker, turn it over to April and Glenda to tell you how it's done in the real world.
Good morning, everyone. Glenda and I are excited to be with you this morning, and we are hopeful that you will be able to take back some points and learn from our story and be able to continue your planning. I think you said you wanted me to talk a little bit about myself. I have so much to go over, so I'm gonna need to watch. Reese is gonna keep me on my time. But I'm the Choice Neighborhood Administrator. As Lucy said, I've been part of the project from the beginning, and I am a staff of one. But we do actually.
We don't recommend that.
No. We do actually interface with agencies throughout the Housing Authority of New Orleans. And I have one of my former Iberville residents that I heard Secretary Carson spoke about yesterday. And Glenda Graves is with us. Glenda, you want to say a few words before we get started?
Yes, hi. As you know, my name is Glenda Graves. I am a former resident of Iberville, formerly, Bienville Basin, formerly the Iberville Housing Development. I had been a resident of Iberville for 30 years, so this was not an easy road for me. Within the process, I understand there was a lot of benefit from it. So as we move along, I'll have more to share with you all.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a little time afterwards if you guys want to talk with Glenda and myself. But let's start quickly with just an overview of our Choice Neighborhoods grant. As Lucy mentioned, we were a 2010 round, so we were one of the first 5 grantees to be awarded these dollars. So we were the test subjects, if I should say. And we were awarded $30.5 million for our Choice grant. Our implementation team, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we had co-developers. So we had 2 developers, HRI Development, and we have McCormick Barron as also, Salazar as also our developers. So they came together and formed the Iberville Revitalization Company. So I don't know if you guys are considering that or not, having 2 different developers. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the off-site as well as the on-site. Iberville was our, HRI was our on-site developer for the Iberville, the former Iberville Public Housing. We also talked about that, of course, our choice focused on housing, people, and neighborhood. Lucy talked about that as well. Now I'd like to show you a map of our area. If you can click it, Glenda, for me. There we go. This is the Choice Neighborhood boundaries, and I just wanted you guys to see this in relation to where our Iberville Public Housing site is. It's 1.75 square miles. Our whole Iberville boundaries, but our Iberville, the Bienville, now Bienville Basin, our Iberville site is actually 10 square blocks, so that equates to about 2 city blocks. So just as you plan this, you can see, I just wanted to give you guys an overview of where we are in relation to the whole boundaries. Now I want to move on to one of my slides is switched, so let me just do that real quick. You can also see within this map actually where we are in relations to the whole city of New Orleans. And so you can see we are smack dead in the middle of the city, which makes it very unique. And that just shows that, we have the Mississippi River to the south of us and the lake to the north of us. And you see how close we are to historic French Quarter as well, and the CBD. So I wanted to show that quickly. Also, I think it's important as you look at your planning activity to think about the history of your neighborhood. For us, you can see we have the French and Spanish settlement, so that was part of our history, and that's hundreds and hundreds of years of history, as well as the Native Americans were also part of that. And as Roma knows, through our archaeology, we found artifacts that actually went back to that time in history. So we found, I'm going to get to that, Mindy. So in saying that, I just want to make sure you guys are thinking as you're planning, you do have to go back. You can't just jump right into this. You do have to go back and look at the history, and that actually activates and engages a lot of different things as you're planning this.
Some more than others.
Yes, that's exactly right. The next slide is Treme. I don't know if you guys had a chance to see, there was a series at one point on HBO that highlighted this area. It's one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods that were settled by free people of color. So that's the distinction there. We also have the cemetery, St. Louis Cemetery, which is the oldest cemetery in the country. And of course, they say that jazz was birthed out of Treme as well as Storyville, and we'll get to Storyville in a minute. On the bottom right, you actually see the Mardi Gras Indians, and what's really unique about that is that at this back in the time where we had slave trade, there were actually slaves, African Americans, as well as Indians that were being traded at that point. And so they bonded and had a partnership. And at that point, we now have looked at how we can actually look at the Mardi Gras Indians and all the culture and the music. All that stuff is part of the history. Now we go to Storyville. And Storyville is unique in the sense that at one point, the city council moved everybody that wanted to gamble, drink, and prostitution happened at Storyville, which is actually on our site, the Iberville site. It's unique in the sense that, of course, for that reason, but also they say the jazz was birthed out of the Storyville era as well. And I'm turning to Roma again because we found several artifacts and brothels when we did our archaeology study. So that is definitely history. And I want to, like I said before, I want to talk about all of this because all of this played into really our housing plan. This is a slide that takes you back to when they started in the 1940s, they actually decided to go ahead and build the Iberville public housing site. And at that point, one of the reasons why they did that is because of the post-World War II era where they needed housing. And this particular housing was not for necessarily African Americans. It was actually white Americans actually moved into these projects in the beginning. This is just another picture just so you can see just the block kind of square style of the buildings after they built the public housing site. And I should also mention that Iberville is the last public housing site in the city of New Orleans. So we have been able to do a lot. The next part is I want to talk about the architectural character, which is so important in a city, in an old city like New Orleans. I mean, we had to look at everything. So not only did we have to look at the Treme area, look at the historic buildings that were part of the Iberville, which I'll talk briefly about. We wanted to be able to connect to the French Quarter, the Treme, our historical buildings, and be able to tie all that into how we came up with our building designs for the Iberville, Bienville, and Glenda just said, and I'll get to that because Cody, actually one of our residents, actually participated in this, and we did a lot of research on this. We didn't want to duplicate what they had, but we wanted to respect the culture and be able to show that in our designs. So now I'm ready for the resident participation and community engagement. I won't spend a lot of time on this based on what Lucy and Reese have told me, but I do want to share the picture that you see right here is actually one of our residents. You want to talk about Cody, Glenda?
Yes. Cody Marshall is one of our leadership residents that was selected by the resident. And once you get to start your planning process, you want to always remember to have the residents involved. All of the residents will not be able to sit at the table, but you can vote for the top 7, and you will have them represent you throughout the whole process, and that's what we did. I was the president of the IRWT resident team. Cody was better than I in designing, so we picked Cody, and Cody designed every building we have on site.
So you need to always look within, kind of before you start looking without, you know, outside of your area, because you have a lot of people that are right there that are very, very talented. Cody is an excellent artist.
Excellent.
And he participated in all of the activities, as well as all of our residents, Glenda
Yes.
and the IRT, which I want to
We
talk
all were
about
strong in different areas.
briefly.
He designed.
So I know most of you guys are definitely, as Glenda said, we had a resident group of 7 members. I know you guys are definitely engaging your residents. And we actually established an Iberville working team, and the Iberville resident team was part of that, the IRT. But I do want to highlight just quickly kind of the engagement process. This is another thing. When you come into a neighborhood, you need to have people that are doing the community engagement that are part of that neighborhood. It's kind of an insult, I think, when you actually bring other people in. So our community engagement people it was actually the Black Men of Labor. They were part of the Treme area. They lived in the Treme area. They knew the history of the area, and we learned from them. So the community engagement process is very important, and it was critical to our stakeholders and our residents and Hano and the city. And I should mention the city, I missed this. The city is actually a co-grantee with us, and I know that's something that they changed as Choice evolved. But we started off as being one of the first grantees, and the city was already a partner with us, which has been essential for us in everything we've done with Choice. But within this community engagement process, I thought the flow chart would be very helpful. As I said, we had an Iberville working team, we had a community engagement team, and we had the Iberville resident working team.
And with that, when April said about a community engagement team, what you want to remember is the community engagement team know the needs of the outer community, meaning the outsides of your, I guess, public housing development. So we pick from there because they knew what was needed on the outside of the community. And we used the residents that was living on site to make decisions on the inside of the community. So that's how you make a decision on your engagement team, because you don't want nobody to just come in and say, hey, we're going to do this, that, and that, and you don't even know the need. You have to know the need of the in and the outside of the community.
So you guys are going to actually give our presentation to them,
yes,
and
we'll
if you
have this.
guys need this and you want to duplicate it, I am fine with that. This is really just showing how information came in and how the ideas were formulated and how we had decision makers, implementation team, and our community at large, because it just can't be those groups either. It has to be the whole everybody within those boundaries. Now we're getting to the real tough stuff. Establishing our stakeholders, what we did, and I think there's a lot of things that change, but initially these were the core principles that we followed before we started anything else. So we knew we might not have known exactly the design at that point. We might not have known exactly what colors the doors were going to be. We might not have known, okay, are we going to do a street grid? So now that the streets will connect to the neighborhood, to the French Quarter, these particular 6, and you're going to see this throughout my presentation, these 6 points were very critical. We knew that we wanted to have mixed income, and we wanted true market rate. We're in the city of New Orleans. We're one block off of the canal, one block off a canal, and we wanted to make sure that we had market rate. We wanted at least 300 public housing units. We wanted to reestablish the street grid. We wanted to also have meaningful place-based approach of how we were going to do the historical buildings, and you get a chance to see that in a little bit. And we wanted to create this green space, and what was also important were saving the trees. We have beautiful oak trees in New Orleans, and that was one of the things that our stakeholders, the residents, and everyone said, do not take away all of our trees, and we were able to do that. So I don't know if you actually have principles where all of your stakeholders have been in a room and you have established what these planning principles are, but that's going to be critical. You got to know, you got to have your map and know exactly which way you're going. Now let's talk about the redevelopment of the Iberville Public Housing Project. If you go to this one, there again, this is just an aerial so you can just see what we were dealing with. It was 23 acres, 821 public housing units, which meant, as you guys know, 821 replacement housing units for us, which was huge. That was how many units we had to replace, and we're still working on that. But it's a hard one, but that's what we had to do. I talked about earlier how the site was really isolated from the French Quarter, the CBD, the biomedical district, and I also mentioned that it was the last public housing site in New Orleans. Going back to our principles, our establishing our stakeholder principles, one of the things that we said we were going to do, and we did do that, is that we put back the historical street grid so that it wasn't this isolated neighborhood anymore. It was neighborhoods that the streets would go through to the French Quarter, they would go through to the lake, to the Lafitte Greenway, everything. So we were able to do that, and that's important. And there again, it goes back to those planning principles. The other thing we said we were going to do, and Roma might even want to comment on this,
Yeah, I would just say that you all were able to add a lot of green space.
we were.
Yes.
You guys, you and Mindy really want me to get to that part, don't you? And I am going to get there.
She's not there yet.
Yeah.
She's not there yet.
So planning for preservation, it was very, very important for us to keep those historical buildings. And I think we have a picture of that when we get further along in my presentation, but that was critical for us to do. And we actually were able to save, which was the most buildings out of all of the Hope 6 and all of the redevelopment that was done in New Orleans. We preserved 16 historic buildings. SHPO was really happy with
I was going
us.
to say, that was a negotiation that went on with the State Historic Preservation Officer. So certainly never forget your Historic Preservation Officer when you're going through your housing process.
That is so
And the
true.
residents had
We
input
That'd be a
on
bad
that, too.
mistake.
Yeah,
Yes.
especially in New Orleans. Yeah, we knew all of those guys. We also talked, and Lucy talked about this, the building type. We actually have multifamily buildings, we have townhouses, we have historic buildings, as I mentioned, and we also have mixed use, which is another thing. If you have the space and you can do that, that is so critical to do. We have a coffee shop, and we have a hot yoga studio, which I belong to and I love. Both of those are minority business owners, own both of those properties. We have actually our property management team is on site. We have a Dell computer lab. We have spaces, because we actually, urban strategies, and I apologize if I did not bring them up. They're our people contractor, and they actually have space there, and we're still able to do that because we were able to endow some of our choice dollars. Thank you, HUD. So urban is still there, a smaller staff, but we also have space for us to have meetings with our residents that are on site. So you want to think about those mixed uses. We also do 4 stories, 3 stories, and 2 stories. 4 is as high as we could go, but now we have a market rate building that's on the other side of Iberville that is covering part of our building, and I'm kind of upset about that one, but and it's going to be all market rate. So that lets you know, too, the activity that once you start redeveloping these properties, you guys will be able to see how other businesses are going to come in and how that's going to spark other economic development. The next slide is just showing our master plan. And there again, we're talking about the reintroduction of the street grid, existing oak trees that we were able to save, the green space, which I'm going to get to, preservation, and then the unity and mixed income, unity, There we go.
And
Now
the
we're here.
diversity.
And the
Also, the
diversity.
design is not just
No,
the same. It's varied.
it is mixed. It's a lot. And even though we ended up using, you're right, because even though there's townhouses, when you look at those and you go throughout our development, and I invite all you guys to come to New Orleans. We'd love to have you there, and we can show you our site and our off-site developments. But you're right. When you look at when you go through our neighborhood, it doesn't feel like it's like a cookie cutter. It really feels like every building looks different, which is important, and especially important in New Orleans with the history. Now I'm to a point where I hope none of you guys have to deal with this. So you can do all the planning in the world and be really good at what you do and get all your stakeholders to agree and get all your tax credits and all your subsidy ready, and guess what'll happen? Your archaeologists will come back and tell you that you have intact burials. We lost 20% of our site once we found out, and you can see, actually, if you look, you can see where the red marks are. Those were all the intact burials that we found. And I won't give you a number because I promised somebody I would never say how many there were.
Shocking.
Tell us what that
Shocking.
means, intact burials. What does that mean?
That means that, for one thing, it means we can't do anything.
That part we've got.
We
don't know
cannot
why.
do anything. So when they started doing the archaeology diggings and discoveries, those were intact. Those are actual burial where people have been buried,
6 people deep
6 people deep, and you cannot do anything.
in brick cribs.
And we even looked at, remember, Roma? We even looked at thinking about maybe we could remove the graves, the intact burials. And when we found out the cost to do
Yes.
that,
Outrageous.
And the
and to
time.
refrigerate, and it was a whole, we talked to Shippo. Shippo was involved with it, and when we looked at the cost of that, we said, no, we can't do that. You gotta contact everybody.
So the development, as it was that you were living in,
Yeah.
was built in part
It was built on top
of a
of a
cemetery.
cemetery.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
it was
Yes.
definitely.
Thank you.
And part of that was, we have 2 cemeteries that are very close to our property. We have St. Louis, Cemetery St. Louis 1 and 2.
Okay.
And so, yeah, those were intact burials,
Right.
which meant, and we're not the only site in New Orleans, of course.
No.
They say the Superdome is built on top
Right.
of a cemetery.
Want to keep moving us through?
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
15, oh my God, you guys just have to come to New Orleans. I'm never gonna get through all of this.
April takes
Be
everybody
careful
on
for
tours.
what you wish.
We would love to. So I'm going to go through this, but this is just showing you the plan modification that we had to do. So
Right.
once we found out that we had those intact burials, like I said, we lost 20% of our site, and we ended up making that green space. And we are preserving the old management building, but you have to go back and start from scratch, and that's major. And let me say one other thing. It's so major that at that point, we had all of our tax credit. We had to go back and talk to them about doing everything different, even with our funding. So it's not just, oh, let's get in a room and do this. This is all the other partners and the financing.
Right.
This is just showing our layout. We have 7 phases. It's showing the building types, which I talked about as well. We're actually on our last phase at Bienville Basin, which I'm very excited about. We closed on that late last year, and everything is under construction, and everything is complete now except Phase 7. Thank you. Advanced designs, there again, we spent a lot of time researching the areas, the French Quarter, looking at the CBD, looking at the original Iberville, and just really making sure that we did that color harvesting so that we know. And I mean, when you talk about colors, you guys, you'll get to this. You're not just talking about the door colors, you're talking about everything. And Cody Marshall was really a key person who helped HRI and our
That's
developers. This is just a picture to show exactly where we were, I guess now, almost a year ago, but you can see the difference from the photos that I showed you earlier. Very proud of what we've been able to do on this site. Here are some photos, Mindy, here we go. Here are some photos of Bienville Basin right now. You can see some of our new stuff, our new townhomes, as well as our multifamily buildings. You can see the street grid in the middle. We're really excited about that. You can see how close, again, we are to the city, and you can see what we did with our historical buildings, which are the largest units on site. Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, they worked really well with the SHPO, and, you know, you did a remarkable job.
We did, but I'm telling you guys, we could not have done this without our HUD team. Lucy, Roma would get on the phone and talk to these guys. Chip, remember our friend Chip? And Mindy, his name is Chip. And Pamela Lawrence is in the team too, so we know we could not have done this without you guys. The other thing, oh no, what's SHPO? Oh, okay. Thank you, Jessica.
Oh, you'll know that's a State Historic Preservation Officer.
Yes, sorry. Forget it's not just us. Yes, those guys are critical, you guys.
Well, one thing I
better get to
gotta
know 'em.
say is every project we've had in New Orleans, I've become best buddies with these
Yes,
guys.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did a lot of talking for us, and we appreciate that. Let's talk about, like we said, unlike Hope 6, where you're dealing with just one development, the Choice neighborhood is dealing with the whole neighborhood. So we had our on-site, which we've talked about now, which is the new Bienville Basin, which was the old former Iberville. But we also have been very successful in our off-site development.
I'm going to ask you to speed this piece up
Oh
for
my
me.
goodness.
I know.
Okay, the next slide is just showing how we strategically decided kind of how we were going to place some of our units that were outside of the Iberville development. This is a critical one because we used choice dollars to purchase this, and hopefully we're going to be closing on this by early to late fall. This is the Winn-Dixie site. These are some of our for-profit and not-for-profit. Don't forget your not-for-profit developers. And one of the things we were able to do is that we got a waiver when we applied for the grant through HUD on our project-based voucher component. So none of our, if they had property that was within the CNI boundaries, choice boundaries, then they didn't have to go through the competitive process that we normally have to go through. They do have to, it has to be a feasible project, but they didn't have to do that. So we have several really successful developments that we've done.
So those developers were already, or those programs were already in the neighborhood, and were able to be part of this?
Well, a lot of them actually bought property once they knew that we had the choice neighborhoods and that we were going to be able to offer project-based vouchers. So Choice sparked a lot of this development, even with these guys. Some of these guys, yes, they did have some property, but they actually went after more property once they knew that, you know, we were trying to do this.
That's great.
Two of the projects that I'm very, very proud of, what do I have, 2 seconds? Two of the projects that I'm very, very proud of, so I'm gonna have to stop, and you guys are gonna have to come to New Orleans, is 2 schools that we did, which were public schools, part of the Orleans Parish School Board. One was Mondi, and you can see the before and the after photos. The other one, this is actually an HRI project at the bottom and has some supportive services, 2222 Tulane. The other school is Bell Art Space that we just basically did a grand opening celebration, and boy, you guys got a chance when you guys came, Roma and Lucy, to see Art Space. It is beautiful. Here we are today. We have on-site, we've done 682 units. We have 278 replacement units. We've done 197 tax credit units and 207 in market rate. All of our units, other than the market rate units, have tax credit subsidy. The off-site, which is what I'm really excited about, we've done 453 replacement units, 195 tax credit, and 76 market rate units. We are currently at 731, Mindy. We only have about another 90 units, and we know where half of those units are right now. So half of that is Winn-Dixie Phase 2. The next one is just showing just all the activity that is happening and that has happened within our development. Okay, Reese, I'm getting there.
Keep going, I'm loving it.
And Glenda, yeah, you can go to project financing, which I know Lucy talked about. This just gives you an example of all the different financing options that we have been able to secure with our Iberville on-site. And a lot of this is still the same for our off-site guys, our off-site developers as well. You know, they went after home money with the city. The city's a co-applicant as well. And they went after, of course, tax credits. We do no developments in the city of New Orleans without tax credit subsidy. How much is choice money? Choice money is, hold on, 9%. That's right. You can't do this with, Choice starts it, but you got to get a lot more funding.
Yeah.
It's a catalyst, but you got to get a lot more funding than just the choice, and that's what we've been able to do. You happy with that, Mindy? Okay, good. The other thing that I want to share with you guys, and there again, it just goes back to what Mindy was just saying, how we, you're looking at all these different financing options to make your project work, is that our completed projects at this point, and you can see some of the stuff that we've talked about. I've talked about some of these things, but a lot of these things have now been spurred because of choice. And these are activities that are happening within 2 blocks of our property. And when you start talking about $500,000 and then you start talking about an investment of almost $1.822 billion, that is a lot. Sorry, you guys, we have to rush this, but challenges and obstacles, I think we've kind of talked about some of that. I mean, the 821 units, that knocked me out when I accepted this job. I'm like, okay. The historic over balancing the historic over what new construction you want to do, looking at all your blighted properties, which I don't know that I mentioned that. That was one of the things, actually that was one of our principles that we went after, and we were able to do that a lot with the off-site projects. A lot of those projects are ones that where they've been vacant homes. And I think the main thing that I want to leave everyone with is that it's so important to have your stakeholders be involved from the beginning of this thing to the end of this thing. And even though we only have about less than probably 50 units, we still are engaging all of our folks. It's nothing for me to talk to, still talking to Lucy and Roma and Pamela, still talking to the city folks. So you want to make sure your stakeholders are involved and they're part of the process. But also, you want to make sure that you don't forget your residents. I'm so proud of Glenda. I know you guys heard the story, but she has bought a house. She's working for the developer on the management side. So when we have residents come to the Bienville, move back to the Bienville Basin, she already knows them. They go in, they talk to her. It's just a really great, open, circular, which I think that was my last.
That's a great opening. And Glenda, I'm going to be really unfair because I'm going to pop a question at you right away. But one of the things that you've just described is that what was actually key, you said, was that set of core principles.
Yes.
Glenda, talk to us about that set of core principles. What was the resident involvement in pulling those together, and how did that process take place from your perspective?
From my perspective, when it was talk just in the community about, oh, they're going to tear it down and they're going to do this, right away you start getting a lot of rejection. Then we got with the management team and we said, hey, we want residents involved. Residents don't be involved, then we're not going to let this happen. Well, we know it's going to happen, but we want to be involved. So what we did, we had a meeting with the entire community and we came up with a team. A working team, because all of the residents in the community weren't able to go sit at the table, and we knew that wouldn't happen. So what we did was we formed a group. We let the community vote on who they thought had the most knowledge, was most outspoken, had a little more knowledge on how this thing should go. So we kind of like got together, we voted. They came up with 7. And the 7 was as strong as ever because we didn't back down. And anyone that came into that development that wanted to service in any capacity, meaning case management, building structure, they had to deal with us. We were there from the beginning to the end. We sat from design, we sat for the meetings, we sat in front, outside, all around the city. Somebody was going to give us answers.
So you were actually an elected group of people?
Yes, yes. It's fair to have the community elect who they want to represent them, because somebody has to be at the table. If no one is at the table, basically you're just getting what's given to you. But with the group of the 7 at the table, we were there to kind of like make decisions on the community. So it was important that we had the community input, we had the community to back us while going out there to make those decisions for them.
And were all of those public housing residents, or did they also, amongst the 7, were there also people who lived just in the surrounding neighborhood?
Well, it was people that were on site, but we had a lot of outside people backing us too. But like I said, we had a community engagement team that was backing us fully, because they were getting input from the outside of the broader community, doing surveys, and we had the residents on site making the decisions also. So we had the outside backing us.
And what do you think was key? I think we hear a number of times that these very complicated projects, it's hard to keep residents engaged, really feeling as though they're making some meaningful input, or they just have the time, because it probably was a whole lot of meetings.
Yes, it was.
How did you handle that?
Well, we made time. Actually, we got with the developers, and unlikely they had a budget. And the seven of my team members and I were able to get paid. So we worked at like an 8-hour job. We stayed up all night. We watched the news. We watched the city website. We watched Hanover website. We were like dogs. Our ears was always to the floor. And, you know, with you being paid for it, you kind of like put a lot in it, because at the end of the day, we have our own lives. And if we're going to support our community and go out and speak and defend the community, we have to have some type of stipend or funding to go on too, because it takes a lot of time out of the day. Because we were meeting in the morning, we met in the evening, we met at night. We designed in the morning, we designed in the evening, we designed at night. Taking trips, going to see what other cities have, you know, and what they've done in the past to bring back new ideas. So it was a job, but the Housing Authority, with the help of HUD, putting funds in the pot, we were able to pay all of the staff, and it worked at like an 8-hour job, and at a good rate.
That's great. So, and there were 7 of you that did that, yes, for these.
Who did it
for now for several years, it sounds like.
Yes. We've been on a team since 2010, and actually we're still active.
Wow.
So I work full-time with HRI Properties as a leasing consultant / whatever come along down the line. And on my off time, I'm actually meeting with April and Pam. I've been keeping in touch with this lady every now and then. These 2 ladies here, you know, so I write their numbers down when I start meeting, because if I have a question and things ain't going right, then I start.
Yeah.
And
And
how,
I
go
just
ahead.
want to add
Yeah,
one
please.
thing. And what we did is, during the initial implementation, we were able to do that. But as Glenda stated, once we got that going, they were still involved, and they weren't getting that stipend.
Right. Even after the funds ran out.
Yeah.
We continued to work because we were invested. The residents started solely dependent on us, even after, so we couldn't back down. But for the most part, it went well, because before this train even took off, investor, we want to be there. You want to do this? We want to be there. Whatever they want to do, we were willing to allow them to do it, but they had to do it with us. We had been there for years. 30 years of my life, I've lived at Iberville. And for somebody to come in and just say, oh, I want to build this. Well, but it was beneficial as time went on. And we got a lot of rejection. You're going to get people that's, oh, they paying them to do that. They paying y'all to get us out of here. That's not true. Because eventually it will go. It's going to go. So I'd rather be at the table than outside.
Absolutely, absolutely. One other set of questions, and then we'll open it up for everyone to add their own or ask their own questions. You described, I think it started with Lucy, but I think it sort of came as we went through, that what was important in this program that you had was mixed income and mixed use.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't think we've talked that much about mixed use. How have you been able to explain that, for instance, to the residents, or explain it to others who might say, gee, well, that's a loss of some units. That could house more of our people.
Well, mixed income was beneficial to us. And I say was beneficial to my community because some of the residents on site were making $50,000, $60,000. And once the developer came in or the income brackets changed, they wouldn't qualify to return. So with them making that kind of money, they would qualify for a tax credit unit. That means 50% of my people can come back now because they'll qualify for a tax credit. We had some people living in it might sound like a lie, but it's not. We have people living on our site making 70 grand in public housing. So what happened was they also qualified to get a market unit. So it was beneficial to us, not only with tax credit, not only with mixed units, but even with market. Because if the market and mix in market wasn't implemented, they wouldn't be able to come back. We would lose a lot of our residents.
That's great. We're going to add something there,
I was
April?
just going to say that, going back to the commercial part of this,
Yes.
is that when we decided there again at our stakeholder meetings, we wanted to be able to attract a community of folks, everybody within our community. Most of our developments throughout New Orleans, and especially when you start talking about our market rate developments, they are doing that. They have, they have units above, they have store, front developments at the bottom. We wanted to be able to compete. That's one of the things we wanted to do. Also, we were intentional about the type of businesses that we wanted there. Both of the coffee shop, back of town coffee shop, as well as Magnolia Yoga Studio, those owners are active in our community. Back of town has done several Section 3 hires for us. The yoga studio, they're doing right now, they just kicked it off this week, they're doing a kids yoga camp. So,
So they're expecting to make a double investment, if you will.
That was part of it, and it was in the writing of it. If you come to this particular site, these are things that we expect for you to be able to do.
That's great.
And that's what they wanted to be able to do those things.
And those uses were also on a fairly busy commercial street.
They are. They're
also.
right on Basin.
Okay.
They're right on Basin. So, and our community, our residents are enjoying that. Coffee, you can just walk to go get coffee, and
There you go.
some of those amenities. So,
I'm going to just, before I close this part out, Glenda, what's your corner piece of advice? Again, these are folks who are now at the front end of this process, knowing all that you have learned, and it's a lot, right? But what would your counsel be to them? What should they be watching? What are the maybe top 2 things you think they should be watching for this to be as successful in their communities?
Well, one of the top things with it being successful is a relationship with the developers. Having a relationship with the developer that's going to come in and do revitalization in your community. And I think the second thing is community involvement, community meetings, community engagement, because that's the only way it's going to be successful. You have to have a relationship with the investor. An investor has to have a relationship with the residents, build a trust relationship. And you have to be involved. Always have the residents involved. I mentioned about the IRWT, but we took the lead, but we also had the other community residents' input. So whatever we talked about at the meeting, it came from the residents. You always want to have a relationship with the developer, and you want to always keep your residents involved. Communication.
Questions? You must have some. Yes, ma'am. Hand right there.
I want to know, did you use choice funds to pay the 7?
no.
So the
Okay.
question was, did you use choice funds to pay the residents, those 7 residents?
No, that was unrestricted funding. And our receiver, our
Can you
receiver.
speak a little closer? This is a biggie.
I am loud, so I can't believe Reese. You're
No,
telling
really.
me to
What
scoot
did I
up.
tell you?
No, we did not use choice funds. Let me be clear about that. We did not use choice funds. HUD had nothing to do with that. That was something that came from our receiver at the time, and Mr. Gilmore wanted to do that, and those funds were unrestricted. And let me stress again that that was in the beginning of the implementation of our grant. So that wasn't something that's been happening now for the last 6 years, so.
Great, thank you. Hand over, oh, take one over, there's the mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I was just curious because I've been reading a lot about New Orleans' crisis with affordable housing, partly because we're doing a regional affordable housing plan in Cook County. And I was curious what kind of controls you might have put in place, because there's been a lot of gentrification around your site in Fallbrook, Moriney, and you're right at the French Quarter, especially with the Airbnb phenomenon. Were there any restrictions that you put inside? And also, that's number one. Number two, you said that you are about 90 units away from achieving your one-for-one replacement, but yet there are only 300 units that are on site. So where are the other units other than that?
They're off-site.
Winn-Dixie, and
They're
so they were
off-site.
those other places.
They're off-site,
Okay.
yes.
And that's within, what, 10 miles of the actual site? Is that right? Those other
No,
locations?
it's
or-
within, no, it's not 10 miles. It's not that.
Within
It's
the
within
Within the
the target
impact neighborhood, so they're all within the
trapezoid,
impact
which is
neighborhood.
like, yeah, 1.75 square miles.
And there are Section 8 vouchers placed with existing developments, is that it?
Yes. Our
Okay.
PBV, project-based vouchers, and also we had permanent supportive housing vouchers too, which are not HANO vouchers, they're actually state vouchers. So with our tax credits, they actually are receiving points when they do the PSH PBV, but we can't count those towards our replacement housing unit count. So we even have larger numbers as far as affordability. Yes, Mindy? Yeah, those are all, they are. Yes.
Okay.
So let me go to your first question. You are totally correct that we are dealing with an affordability crisis in the city of New Orleans. And I think part of that is Hannah is doing what they need to, what we can do on our end as the housing authority. There's a couple of things going on. Our new mayor, Cantrell, Latoya Cantrell, she is now going back, and the city council, her current council members are now looking at what we can do about the Airbnb, those particular types of developments. You're right, the French Quarter. So we have owners that at one point, before all this came about, they were renting those properties, you know, they were possibly even Section 8 properties. And now, and tourism in New Orleans is, I mean, it's the #1 place to go. I think actually they had that on one of the news outlets, that it's the #1 tourist site right now. So they are going back now to kind of really get more control of this, because it is totally out of control, where we have lost some affordable units because of the, you know, the Airbnb and those situations. The other thing that we are fighting right now at the state level is that we had put something in, Landrieu actually did this along with our governor. We had put in a stipulation that if you get tax credits, you get basically federal tax credits, that you had to do a percentage of affordable units. They are now trying to overturn that, and so the city council is fighting so that that doesn't happen. So if you, no matter what your development is, unless you're doing all market rate, if you were doing any type of subsidized tax credits, you had to do a percentage of affordable housing. They're trying to not do that now, so we're fighting that right now.
So the policy discussions are not a moment in time, but are something
are
that just
continued.
are constantly there, and you have to sort of stay vigilant with those.
You do.
Great, okay. Next hand, I see a mic over here, it's waving, it's got a person holding it.
I was just curious, at the start of the process, did you engage current landlords?
That's interesting. Did we do that? I think we did, because what we did is when we had our community engagement meetings, we invited the whole neighborhoods. So we would actually send out mailers, we would do door-to-door and community, that's why I'm saying that community engagement team is critical. They would go door to door. So yes, we would have, Section 8 landlords, private landlords, people that just own their own businesses within our area. All of those folks were invited out to all of our design meetings, any of our planning meetings, anything that we were going to do, we invited the community out for that.
Yeah, we had our first big meeting over at Craig
Can you speak up a little more?
Yeah,
We had our first big meeting
You're right.
at Craig School, and that was not on-site, that was off-site in the Treme community.
That's a good point, Glenda. That's the other thing you want to do. I don't know if you guys are dealing with, like what we're dealing with, like a development on site. We went outside of Iberville. Matter of fact, we were demoing and moving our residents, so a lot of that stuff couldn't happen on site anyway. But we were out in the community when we had these community engagement meetings all over. And you're right, Glenda,
Right.
we started
And we
at
had
Craig
to
Middle.
engage with the outside homeowners because we needed relocation space for the residents. So before we started that, we start meeting with them and letting them know what's going on and find out what they had available and if we can place some of our residents in the Treme area until redevelopment was done.
Good. Good. Another hand? Sir, yeah?
Yeah, congratulations, guys. This is great to see, and especially because I don't think any of the teams in this room will deal with the level of fraught politics that you have to go through in New Orleans to get anything accomplished. To get to where you are is just really something to be commended. So congratulations.
Thank
I had
you.
just two quick questions. One was about the preservationist politics. I was curious if you had any pushback to demolishing the site initially, and how much external control, we sometimes call them paternalistic preservationists, how much outside groups tried to influence what was happening with the work that you were doing with stakeholders. And then the last one is, I'm just curious because you had much more constructive language, but we would call those speculators, the people that bought land
Yeah.
as soon as they knew how you engage them in a constructive way,
Yeah. You
instead
might
of
wanna
just
talk
trying
about
to
that.
buy them
That's
out of the project.
Nice question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you are 110% right. We definitely had folks that were against the development. It's interesting, though, because some of those folks, we had one large group, we won't mention the name, but they didn't even live in New Orleans. That's what was interesting about that. And they would show up. But I have to say, and Roma can probably speak to this, we actually did not have much people that were protesting our development as compared to the Big Four.
Right.
The Big Four had residents like chained to the
Right.
fence and some other activities. We really, really did not deal with that. I think because we were at a point where, because of our location too, it was critical that folks wanted affordable housing. We wanted to be able to do something really big on that project and be able to bring back some of our former Iberville residents, wanted to be able to do market rate. We didn't get a lot of resistance, and the resistance we did receive, like I said, was from an organization that was not even affiliated with New Orleans.
Yeah, we
I
had,
don't know if you want to speak to that, Glenda.
we had this one big
That was
group that would
interesting.
show up, and we didn't even know where they come from. We were the leaders, and we didn't know. They would just show up, and they would show out with bullhorns, screaming and hollering and pacing in front of buildings and trying to
Yeah.
stop the demolition. And so one day, we got bold. We asked where they from and where do they live, and nobody could tell us.
Yeah.
I promise. We didn't know where they come from, and they still exist. They don't come now, but they still exist. And if you watch the news, if something else happens in New Orleans where they're demolishing something, they show up. And the reason why they show up is because we found out later that they didn't want us in their neighborhood. They didn't live here, but they had property around the city. And their property was within our C&I boundaries, and they didn't want us there. So they were showing up to stop demolition so that we couldn't live in houses or mid-rises or townhomes.
Well,
I think I think one of the things that you have to do is you just have to always have a consistent message. And I think that's what we did when we were in front of the media, any kind of media print, any kind of news media. We always had a consistent message, and that was very, very, very important. And and Glenda can speak
And it
speak
was,
to
the
this
message
as well.
was basically working with the people.
Yeah.
We housed our residents. We went out and found safe, decent, clean living. We actually let them pick where they wanted to live. We took them there to meet the landlord. We did the applications. We had a relocation team in place, and they were from Chicago. And the name of it was Urban Relocation, and they done a fabulous job with relocating our residents and also bringing them back. But we went out and we found housing, of their choice, and we made sure that we kept in contact with them, so when the redevelopment was done, that they can come back to the site.
Let me go back to your question, because I don't think we answered one of your questions, and that was, how did we deal with the preservationists? And I'll just go back. I will just clearly say that that is about relationships. If you really think that you can do this work without relationships, you guys are totally wrong. And you're probably in the wrong business. Because it is so important to sit down with these people. The guy that was on that site, along with our developers, along with our archaeologists in those holes digging, was Chip. And we knew Chip. Y'all laughing, but we knew Chip. And when Chip came, April, I need you out here on this site. We showed up. We knew what we needed to do. You have to have those relationships, so they'll know exactly what you're doing. That's horrible when people walk into something and they're blindsided.
Yeah.
That's another thing. We gave information. Everything I knew, Lucy knew, Roma knew, Pamela knew. It's like you got to keep that channel of communication and what you're doing. You might be like, oh, I don't want to tell these people. Let's wait. It's better to get permission.
I'll reiterate that, because it's much better to just lay it on the line.
You got to.
That's great. I think there's one hand I saw in the back there.
Yeah, I had a question as it relates to your timing. So when you found out about with the setback with the burial ground, how long did it take? I'm sorry if you said this already. How long did it take you to regroup and finally get going? That's my first question. And my second question relates to the size of the units. You had mentioned that the preserved units were larger than the new units, and
they were just larger in
They were
just larger in
It was a
size.
redo. They actually knocked down walls
Right.
to enlarge them.
Yeah, they
Right.
reconfigured the
Yeah.
units.
Great.
Let's see, your first question was, how long did we get back? Well, I'm going to tell you, my friend, we were on the phone the next hour, okay? So, I mean, we had phone calls, and all of us were on the phone. It was late nights, but we were really, I think, fortunate, because I know Roma said, April, you're lucky they're not shutting this thing down on you. I mean, you have seen, I think you mentioned New York and some other places where you stopped for years.
Yeah.
We were the next day getting on the phone, talking to our contacts at the state, talking to our city reps, and we were ready to rock and roll probably about maybe 60 days later. I mean, where we were able to get back and say, okay, we know we can't do anything here, so now you bring the community back together, our residents back together, and say, what is this green space going to look like? What are we going to do? No investors wanted to touch that, but you can't blame them. So our on-site developer, HRI, said, April, we can try to see what we can do here, but you can only go down so far deep as far as it's nothing you can do but green space. And like I said, we lost 20% of our site, but as far as continuing with archaeology, we were ready and probably up and ready to go like 30 to 60 days later.
But the other thing is, they had a developer that was very familiar with historic restoration, revitalization. So, it wasn't like anybody was flying blind.
That's true.
No, but you also,
We knew by our phase.
you redesigned and increased your density on the rest of the site to make up for the units that were lost because of the cemetery.
Right. We had to back into it at that point, because then if you go back to our principles, we had so many units we had to do on that site. So now we're backing into it, starting kind of really over again, going, how are we going to now? We've committed these units to the site, and now we have these burials. And folks don't care. At the end of the day, they want those units, and we wanted those units. So
All of the newspapers said, in New Orleans, we're used to living on top of dead people.
There you
And
go.
actually, it was an attraction for some folks.
Yeah.
Well,
You tell
And
them
it's-
that's the
and it's-
Cemetery Museum.
Oh, yeah. And we have one historic building that because of the intact burials, that now we have a developer, and this is really gonna be neat. I cannot wait till this happens. That we're actually gonna have a cemetery, a museum cemetery. So it is, and actually the guys that are gonna do this are the same guys that did our World War II museum. So it's gonna be fabulous.
That's great. And while not all of us run into cemeteries as we're doing our site prep work, it is certainly quite common to run into other kinds of environmental issues. So just remembering that you may find yourself having to make a major adaptation of your site plan and configuration in order to accommodate that.
I ran into an eagle's nest once, and it shut the project down for a year.
Birds,
lucky.
you never know. On that note, thank you. A wonderful panel. We are very fortunate to have had. Let me very quickly say that Mike and McCool are going to make themselves available from 12:30 until 1:30. And we'll do sort of one-on-one. So if something that you've heard or something that has triggered some thinking in your mind over the last 2 days about the work that they're speaking to you about in making a place and how to have it be a place that's a source of pride and confidence building, please, even if it's just to make the initial contact, please go and see them. They are there. McCool, yes. One more time? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You just got another half hour. 12. I'll stop talking really fast then. So as soon as I stop talking, you're all good to go. So how are we doing with the feedback sheets? You should have two now, one from the morning and one from the afternoon. Okay. Do I see some scratching? Oh, you're digging them up. Good. I knew you could do this. I believe that really winds us up for the 1:30. So 1:30 back in this room. Remember, the cardinal issue is you walk past doors that go into the building and walk all the way around to the door that you came in this morning. That's the only entrance back in. Okay? So we'll see you back here at 1:30. Thank you all, and thank you again, panel.